Who in your family was a refugee, a migrant, a foreigner? Think back in your history, and you'll likely identify one of your forefathers or mothers who came to this country because of war, because of hunger, persecution, or natural disaster. This was the situation with my father, George Cummin Ellis, in the upper left. He grew up in Nazi-occupied Greece, a time when 1 Athenian in 5 died of starvation. Greece following World War II was not much better off. There was civil war being fought throughout the country. And my father arrived in the United States in 1952 with no money, no English, and no friends. And it's a similar situation today with some 70 million people, the population of the entire southern United States, fleeing from their homes because of hunger, natural disaster, persecution, war, more refugees than at any other time since the end of World War II. Now, I use the word refugee to mean someone who has passed from one country across a border into another country. Refugees are protected by the United Nations Convention of 1951, which specifies that refugees are to be provided their human needs, and they are not to be forcefully pushed back into the countries from which they fled. Most refugees today are women and children. They're traveling with no money, no documents, no friends. Now, in the same breath, we also have to talk about IDPs, that is, internally displaced persons. These are those who have been pushed from their homes, but they are still within the same country. Often the situation of IDPs is often even worse than that of refugees because they are not afforded the United Nations defined rights of refugees. Ours is today a world in motion. There are Central Americans fleeing crime and poverty, moving northward. In East Africa and West Africa, those Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram who kidnap their daughters, who force their sons to be child soldiers. In Myanmar, there's the 6 million Rohingya people selected for ethnic cleansing, expelled from that country, moving eastward toward Thailand and westward toward Bangladesh, to say nothing of today's catastrophe in Syria, Yemen, and the Sudans. I'm a physician with the Institute for International Medicine, and my view on this is these are problems of truly biblical proportions. Some of you are familiar with the history of the ancient Israelites. The patriarch Jacob was living in Canaan. There was no food, was famine in the land, and Jacob was hungry. He heard that there was food in Egypt, and so he sent 2 sons down to see if this was true. The boys came back with an encouraging report. Yes, there is food, and there's also an invitation to come live in Egypt. And so Jacob took his entire family, about 70 persons, and they traveled into the land of the Pharaohs. What happened next? A new Pharaoh came to power, one who was not familiar with Jacob, and he pounced on the Hebrew people. He enslaved them. For 430 years, they worked the fields and they did the construction for the Egyptians. Until under Moses, they left Egypt and back to the land of the Hebrews. It's no surprise that Hebrew scripture is replete with instruction about the treatment of foreigners. Leviticus declares, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourselves. For remember, you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt, and I am the Lord your God. The Institute for International Medicine was founded 18 years ago with the mission of equipping healthcare professionals with the unique skills to serve the world's most forgotten people. Those who are disabled, elderly, chronically ill, veterans, victims of war and disaster. My role at the Institute for International Medicine today includes the Middle East. And this is a picture of Islamic State control 5 years ago. Northern Iraq, great swaths of eastern Syria controlled by Islamic State, and everywhere they arrived, the schools were closed, the women were shuttered, businesses shut down, and anyone who resists, executed. Some 12 million people, the population of Ohio, fled eastward toward Iraq, westward towards Jordan, seeking refuge. One of them was Ammar. I met Ammar at this time last year in northern Iraq. He is a Yazidi. Yazidi people are a unique religious minority identified by Islamic State as Satan worshipers. So, of course, you can do anything you want to with a Satan worshiper. They killed them by the tens of thousands. Ammar is one of the fortunate ones. He left with his family 5 years ago, and he's been living in a tent hosted by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. He's in a tent where it's 140 degrees in the summer and below freezing in the winter, a tent among some other tents, among tens of thousands of tents. Imagine yourself being tasked with responsibility to provide care for Ammar and thousands of his refugee neighbors. Where would you possibly begin? Well, international refugee care can be divided into 4 phases, and we're going to touch on these one by one. The first phase is pre-emergent. That is, you see a conflict brewing, and before people are forced from their homes, it's time for intervention. It's time to send in your negotiating team. Find a just resolution to this potential conflict before the most vulnerable are forced from home. It's also a time for you to develop your teams and to stage your supplies. Because if this fails, then people will begin to arrive, hundreds a day, thousands a day. You're in the emergency phase. What will they immediately need? Shelter, food, water. How much water does a refugee need? Well, we know the human body requires a half a gallon a day. But you also need food for bathing, cooking, toileting, in all at least 5 gallons per person per day. These people will be sick. What are the diseases of refugees? They are the diseases of poverty, pneumonia, dysentery, malaria in some regions. They will have chronic health problems. They'll have myocardial infarctions and strokes and asthma attacks. Women will deliver their babies. Yes, refugee women will deliver at 9 months, just like everyone else. So you, as their leader, must be prepared to deliver their babies, to manage the obstetric complications, to care for the newborns. Hunger will underlie all of this. Food insecurity is one of the definitions of refugee status. And then there will be epidemic diseases. Vulnerable people living in close proximity, they'll get scabies, measles, COVID. All of this will require your leadership. Now, let's fast forward 3 or 4 months. The crisis is abating. Fewer people are arriving. But there's no resolution. No one's going home. And now it appears that these people will be with you for months or even years. You're in the maintenance phase. What else will they need? Well, children will need school. Adults will need opportunity to earn income. Communities will need to learn to live together. Security and conflict is a big problem in refugee communities. We have traumatized people who are living in close proximity with one another, who are inevitably going to get into arguments, they are also particularly susceptible to influence from outside forces. Political forces will come in and try to recruit refugee people for their various factions. This will require your attention. And then where are you going to locate these people? Now, Ammar lives in a desert. There's plenty of space. But there's no food, there's no water, there's no jobs, there's no schools. These must all be trucked in or bussed out. And for this reason, many international refugee care leaders prefer to locate them in urban areas where there is infrastructure. But this is accompanied by host refugee conflicts. Local parents will begin to say, there's too many refugee kids in the school and my children are not getting enough attention. Local workers will say, oh, we've got a glut of low-income laborers and we're losing our jobs. You'll have to attend to those kind of relationships as well. And at the same time, someone, maybe even you, is trying to find a long-term solution to what caused these people to flee in the first place. What are the options? Some refugees will stay on in their host country. This is Ammar's plan. Islamic State doesn't control territory anymore, but they continue to control the minds of many people. And Ammar is convinced that if he returns to Syria, he will be killed. He'll stay on indefinitely. A very small number will immigrate to a third country, Western Europe, even the United States. But most refugees, like Ammar's son, simply want to return home in peace. Now, what can you do on behalf of Ammar and his family? First up, track the international news. Choose a source that regularly updates you on what's happening around the globe, especially with vulnerable people. And then as you are informed, express your values to your political leaders that our nation reflect care towards these most vulnerable people on the planet. Look for opportunities to serve those who have been resettled in your community. Now, in recent years, we haven't had many new international refugees, but those who are already here continue to need assistance with improving their language skills, finding a job, helping their children do well in school. You could volunteer your service 2 half-days a month with a reputable refugee resettlement agency in your city, providing direct care and intervention on their behalf. Now, you could even step it up even more. You could get an advanced degree in refugee care and then pursue a career with one of these renowned healthcare refugee resettlement organizations like the United Nations Refugee Agency. And as you do all of these things on behalf of the world's most vulnerable, remember the admonition to love them as yourself, for you or someone in your family, like my father, was once a migrant, a foreigner, or a refugee.